This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. First, I would like to announce that the Planning Commission meeting scheduled for 7 p.m. has been canceled. The joint Planning Commission Board of Commissioners meeting, as duly advertised, will now commence. The first agenda item is call to order, which I just did, and agenda item 2 is Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Greg, will you do the roll call?
Yes. Trevor Domba.
Present.
Tim Dugan.
Here.
Andrew Flagg.
Here.
Brian Height.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
Mark Luth.
Here.
David Wilson. David Wilson is not online, so he is not here. Monica Hodges.
Here.
David Kennedy. He is not online, so he is not here. Brad Osborne.
Here.
Mike Walk. Mike Walk is not online, so he is not here. We have 3 commissioners present, sufficient for a quorum.
Thank you. I would also like to introduce some staff that's in attendance. Chris Stroller, our long-range planner, Dave Manhart, our Director of Community Development, and Greg Adams, our planner. And also joining us is Hannah Clark from Michael Baker International, our consultant. Greg, will you do the meeting rules?
For an orderly meeting wherein all attendees may be able to fully participate, we ask that you adhere to the following rules. Please mute your microphone or telephone to avoid background noise that may cause interference in the meeting and make it difficult for others to hear. Staff may mute microphones of remote attendees if needed. Public questions and comments will be taken at periodic intervals throughout the agenda. We will start with no time limits, but the Planning Commission Chairman may impose a time limitation if there are many questions or if the meeting is running short on time. For in-person attendees, please raise your hand to be recognized and then move to the podium when directed and state your name, address, comment, or question. Please turn the microphone on before speaking and off when done. For remote attendees, the chat box feature will be active throughout the meeting. If you have a comment or question, please type your full name and address in the chat box. When you are recognized and so directed, please unmute your microphone and state your question or comment. Mute your microphone when done. For those accessing the meeting by phone only, staff will periodically ask for caller comments and unmute all callers. Callers must identify their name and address prior to making a comment. Your cooperation and adherence to these rules will ensure an orderly and respectful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Agenda item number 3 is the approval of minutes. Are there any changes or corrections from anybody in attendance? Hearing none, I need a motion for approval.
So moved.
I'll second that. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Brian, I'm not opposed, but I need to abstain since I wasn't here at the
I was
meeting.
getting to abstentions.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, so we have 1 abstention. Agenda item number 5, we're skipping over 4, is the comprehensive plan goals and implementation. I'll now turn it over to Dave Manhart, our Director of Community Development.
So we are here at the Planning Commission workshop, or the Comprehensive Plan workshop. We have a joint meeting since we have a quorum at workshop number 10. So this is the proposed timeline we've talked about since the beginning. I'm just kind of breeze through some of the early stuff here. This was a later timeline that we shared. We are pushed back a month from the September Trying to get it bigger on the screen.
Could hide everyone.
So we're here in the October meeting. We will be covering the land use draft and implementation tonight. The modeling, we're moving to be conducted during the public comment period, because for the modeling, we need to have the draft land use plan so that we can provide them the inputs for that plan. So that'll be part of the public comment period. So we've made it through virtually all of the components of the comprehensive plan. We're here at mapping and land use plan, and we have a draft comprehensive plan as well. And we will also talk about implementation because that's a big focus of the plan. So I want to get into that part of it. And I already mentioned the modeling will be part of the public comment period. So the way we've run the meetings, we'll address any public comment. Typically, it's been light during this period, really because this is intended to be the workshops where we're putting everything together. Once we open to public comment, I hope, and well, let me change that. I expect that we will have more public comment to review at the workshops. At each meeting, we review the synthesized goals and objectives, which is what we have for the land use. And then we open up the comment period to approve those to be posted and included into the draft. So here we are at the review. Any questions so far?
I just have a question on the modeling. So the public will be commenting on that before the planning commission has had an opportunity.
The modeling will be treated as a public comment. So it'll be incorporated into it's basically evaluating the draft plan. So that evaluation will be considered a public comment. So if we need to modify things based on those outputs, and that'll be at November, I'm thinking the November meeting, if we can do that. If not, December meeting, or we'll have to do a planning commission meeting, but we'll have to figure out the exact timing on that. Because everything hinges on the land use plan, because that's how we generate the inputs for those models.
Thank you.
You're
I have
welcome.
a follow-up to Commissioner Kelly's question. Who's doing the modeling for transportation?
That would be, so Keystone, Scott Pistursky did the model for the first version. So this is all the baseline information is in there. So it's the base model. We're just changing inputs.
Okay, thank you.
So it should be, hopefully go smoother and quicker.
Dave, I have a
Yep.
quick question. Excuse me. If this is redundant, I apologize because I was not at the last comp plan meeting, but I did notice in the minutes that it was brought up was Mr. Spiegel's letter addressed at 309 in Ridgeview. Likewise, there was another letter from a resident. It was Mr. William Stanley. Was his letter also taken into consideration for transportation?
So Mr. Spiegel's letter was the 309 letter and talked about looking at things more holistically. So there wasn't any direct action taken based on that letter or the other letter. But we have incorporated that into the thought process. Yeah, and a lot of the details of the letter will get addressed, or they'll have an opportunity to expand on that when we get into some of the implementation items. For example, the transportation plan. That's going to be the big, where the pun intended here, where the rubber meets the road, is where we can really get into some of those details. One of the things that'll come out of that is recommended updates to the official map. So, the concept of connectors, which Mr. Stanley was that was a big concern of his, where we have connectors on the existing official map and alternatives for that. So during the transportation plan, we might end up calling it something else, but in implementation, it says transportation. And that's where we can really get into details. And that's a lot of those letters were very detailed. So that's kind of where that piece will fit in. So we try and keep the comprehensive plan very high level and policy oriented and make recommendations for things to dig deeper into.
Dave, I have a follow-up. I apologize. The modeling by Keystone, it's been a couple of years. Is it Scott Pasterski who did the modeling for us for the road networks and
Yes.
traffic and all that?
Yes.
I guess after our last meeting, I was thinking about that. I had asked a question about it. And is that modeling, that projection that was performed for the township, going to be somehow integrated into what we're going to present to the community to comment on? Because it seems that those two things should be connected when we're looking at future growth.
Yes, I hadn't really thought about how best to present findings of those models, but I'm starting to think having a workshop around the results of those models is probably appropriate, so we can use that as a public engagement piece of the draft. And in addition to reviewing the models and the outputs, public will have an opportunity to comment. So I hadn't really thought of that, but that's probably the best way to handle that. And we'll have to kind of figure out when and how that'll happen, but we'll definitely make it happen.
Thank you.
Dave, as a follow-up to that, would that be prior to the plan coming to the commissioners?
Yes, so that'll be during the 45-day, well, we'll see. And we'll cover timeline after we get through the land use and the implementation. I hope to get to timeline so we can kind of really focus and nail down dates.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
But we'll have to figure out the timing. It may occur during the 45-day period, or it may occur after the 45-day period. And then based on results, and Hannah can kind of talk to, changes that can be made to the draft. There's some wiggle room on what we can change, but if it's substantive, then we have to really come back to the process. So, for example, if we go through that modeling process and it blows up the models, then that's a sign that we need to go back to the drawing board. I really hope and don't expect that to happen, but based on some of how we've done and some of the changes we've made, I don't think that'll happen. Well, yeah, better not.
And I'm just curious, since our last meeting, you held workshops at the schools and also at the Fall Fest to get comment. Is that something you're going to share with the Planning Commission so we understand the community's first look at these?
So those were open houses, and I'll let Chris kind of talk about those.
Yeah, so I was going to kind of go over it more at the end, just a summary of that. So we had open house meetings at all of the schools in the Parkland School District within the township. And it was an open house format where Greg and I had the draft goals and strategies. We had the draft land use plan, and we really had more of an opportunity to have a conversation with people instead of a presentation, which I think was really helpful. I would say the support was really positive from everybody that we talked to. It was nice to have the open house format so that every conversation we could kind of get a little bit deeper into each element instead of just saying, here are kind of the goals and here's the implementation item after it. We were really pleased to get feedback on the draft land use plan from them, and some of the concepts that we're going through tonight. Again, really just presenting it to people to show the purpose of bringing all these elements together and how that kind of can set the stage for future land use. I would say altogether from the open houses, not from the park event, the open houses, we probably had about maybe 20 participants come out, and it was nice when we did have an opportunity with some events going on at the schools that we could get some people to kind of pop in. And so there were several people who were excited to actually come out and really spent, I would say, maybe an hour with us, just having a long conversation. We did have some media coverage at one of the events. We had WLRV, local news radio, come out and actually interview us on the plan and what the comprehensive plan is doing, and just a little bit on the township. And I'd say for the park, we must have talked to, I would say, 24 people. Some of it just curious and getting some feedback, and we gave them some pamphlets. But we probably had some pretty substantive conversations with, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 people through that process.
Thank you.
And I can actually start to jump in on land use unless there's any other questions about public input up to this point.
I mean, was it 20 people per school or 20 people total?
20 people total. These were 2 hours after hours at the school, and we spread them out in the neighborhoods. A lot of the feedback we got was most people knew a little bit about what was going on. They kind of remembered the early exercises we did a couple years ago, in kind of the more deeper dive into the like the how should we grow and where should we grow exercises like that. And this was really a chance for us to just show the public the plan is wrapping up. Here's how we've taken all of that input and summarized it, kind of asking for their feedback to say, did we get it right? And to really remind them of the upcoming 45-day public comment period, where we will have the entire draft for them to review and make actual comments on.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be sure, about 20 people we actually had conversations with, probably twice that many we were able to distribute flyers or booklets to. So they were able to take that information home and see the available comments on the website. So we did reach a number of people.
Yeah, that's a great point. We had the flyers with us. We had the little pamphlets, and like I mentioned, there were several events happening at some of the schools. So even if people didn't take the time to come sit down with Greg and I to talk, they took the flyers that really outlined the draft goals and had the QR code for any online comments. So moving on to the kind of final element here, the land use plan. This is just the summary of what the municipality's planning code requires for a plan for land use. Again, it's really taking all of the elements that we have talked about previously, blending them together to kind of set some physical boundaries and look at how this all comes together in one geography. And then we're going to, if you recall from last month's meeting, we introduced the idea of place types, which is a way for us to kind of synthesize some information. Again, land use is a very broad brush type of approach. It's high level. Place types helps us kind of get a little bit more down to the ground in what we would like to see in some of these areas. It also gives us really a step forward in some of the implementation down the line if we are going to see any zoning changes, if we're going to see any more implementation and to some of our policies that we kind of have more of a footprint to work from. So again, the idea of place types, it's that idea of placemaking where we can start to put together concepts or give examples of what we would want to see in, say, residential is a very broad idea, but when we're talking about, is it a more neighborhood feel? Is it more of a mixed use sense, or are we talking condos, apartments, that sort of thing? And then, as I mentioned, it'll be the kind of guiding document if we utilize this for zoning down the line. So when we went through place types last time, if you recall, we had a lot, about 21 different place types that we had used from examples in other areas that we've seen. We really synthesized that down and tried to look at how these can be applied to the specifics of South Whitehall. We've narrowed it down to about 12 place types that we really like and that we think are utilized well in the proposed land uses. So the first being open space. And this is really what's covering all of our natural areas, preserved lands, recreation areas, whether that be active or passive recreation. And it gives you a sense of really just open. And then agriculture, everything that's surrounding agriculture, whether that's working farms. We like the idea of throwing in some ideas of farmettes and smaller scale farms. Agritainment is certainly a big thing that's growing, especially this time of year. You can see a lot of that in the area, and preserved agriculture through agricultural easements as well.
Chris? May I interrupt
Yes,
just for a
Brad,
second?
yes.
Okay. Is that okay? Mr. Height? My comment?
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
So the feedback that you've gotten in these various settings, were any of the people who are part of this setting business owners or landowners? And if so, what were the comments? And if not?
I would say in the latest kind of outreach, because it was held at the schools, we got a lot of families, parents, and that sort of resident. Everyone that we talked to we made sure that they were a resident. And at the park event, they said we had about 20 people. We definitely had more interested, but out of residents, there was probably only about 24 that we actually talked to, because that was a larger event that we had other folks there. And specifically, I don't think that we had anyone who was specifically a business owner. I know we had talked about that a little bit, but it was mostly families and residents of the neighborhoods that were at the schools we were in.
As a follow-up, is there any plan that we may have to reach out to the business community and significant landowners to make sure we have their input? Or are we going to take a passive role and wait for that input to come if it comes?
In the prior to the open houses, when we kind of did the promotion for the open houses, we have a list of about 300 different emails and names of residents. I believe they're all residents. We can maybe cross-reference to see if there are some just business owners on that who aren't residents that we have sent the information to let them know of the upcoming open houses. And that's also the same list that we will send out the promotion for the 45-day public comment period. So that I didn't get any response back from a couple of people responded back, just letting me know that they received it. But they have the ability to comment on everything on the website right now. And that's where we're really driving people. And then once we have the 45-day period open with the plan, it'll be the same online comment form. And then we're working out an idea to have a plan here at the Township building for people to stop by and give comments.
And I think we can certainly, I wrote it down as a focal point for during that 45-day public comment period to actually send it directly to, I think we had like a stakeholder list that we worked up early on with some contact information, and we can use that and send it directly to the list that we have. Make a comment on the website or somewhere that if you are a business owner, landowner, contact us, we can get you a copy directly. We'll figure out how best to shape that.
Great, thank you.
Just to follow up, because we've had at least one presentation and one letter read by the owners of Veris. Of course, there's probably another large landowner out there as well that a lot of this stuff would affect. Are they on any of those lists?
Did you say yes?
This is a follow-up. I believe the township held 4 stakeholder meetings on the front end of this process. Is that correct?
We certainly reached out to stakeholders. They were individual meetings, and 4 sounds about right.
I remember seeing that there were surveys
was
at
4,
Muhlenberg and
yeah.
Cedar Crest, and I thought that sticks in my mind. But my question was, can we circle back around to the people who did
Absolutely.
participate?
And that's kind of the
and
list that I'm talking
kind of
about.
close the loop.
That we use to get any stakeholder information. Like very early in the process, I remember reaching out to a owner of one of the shopping malls. And he came in and we kind of told him what process we were undertaking and explained things to him. And it's a great opportunity to come circle back on those folks that we did reach out to.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions on the public engagement? Moving on to the rest of the place types. The examples here are rural and conservation subdivision. These are some of the reasons I really like the idea of using place types to introduce some concepts that may not be as well known to the general public. So rural really talks about kind of the feel of maybe a rural road. We introduce the concept of crossroads villages and conservation subdivision. We talked a little bit about last time. This is the idea of cluster development, whether that be residential or commercial or mixed, and really focusing on the preserved open space and the natural resources of those developments. And again, it could be applied to multiple land use types. Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah. As we go through these land use place types, how specific are they as you're providing examples to these each unique place types? Or is that something that, would it be drilled down more specifically in zoning or saldo? Or are they kind of open for interpretation?
I would say at this stage, this is what we're really asking for feedback on. At this stage for the comprehensive plan, we're talking about introducing the idea of place types so that we can provide more examples of what could be seen in certain land uses. But then to answer your earlier question, these could lead zoning changes in the future. This could maybe give us a step forward in how we look at some of our zoning changes, because we would already have kind of the general idea of where we would like to see certain changes and what could actually look at what types of uses could fulfill the zoning ordinance.
And just to kind of piggyback, one of the things that we've been very deliberate about in laying this out is having this be a usable plan. So when it comes to time for the zoning discussion, we have this list of place types, and I think they'll purposely be broad brush, and details get worked out at the zoning side. So, think of it as a funnel. The comp plan lays this broad plan, and as we start going into details of zoning, we'll say, okay, rural roadside, that's a house right on a rural road with a driveway that accesses. What does that mean? What are the details of that? What's the maximum lot size and all of that, or minimum lot size? And so those are the details that get worked out during the zoning conversation. But I think it's important to have that. And I'll go back to the concept of a workbook. So, we have this document that has, it'll be 4 pages of the document that lay out what the comp plan envisions for these different land uses. And then details get worked out in the zoning conversation.
From a presentation standpoint, how do you communicate the options within one of these to the public during this public comment period? Because I'm assuming it'll be online and maybe a little bit limited. So how do we explain to the residents and the businesses and landowners this word could actually envision these 6 different types to get feedback?
Pictures and using local examples are really the 2 ways that really convey the message. We could probably write a book and still not accomplish what a picture and a local example will do. So the intent was, and we'll have to see how it lays out, to have a picture example of each and then a location. So during the last one for Crossroads Village, we had Goodsville was an example. So when we say Goodsville, the South Whitehall residents, everybody knows what we're talking about. Not everybody. A lot of people do. But then having the picture to accompany that is going to be how you drive home that idea.
Thank you.
Just one last question. Is the goal to protect or to optimize the opportunity?
I would say both.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, like certain things.
They become challengeable, and do we have the proper frame to ensure that what was established and perceived, holds up?
Yeah. And that's why we have this process, and we have the comprehensive plan, and we have these place types as the examples. And when it comes to zoning, and if there's an objection to that zoning, we haven't laid out in the comp plan. And this was the process that we followed, and everything's documented. So it sets the stage and is like the policy behind any ordinance changes or what other changes come out of that. So it's kind of that basis, that rationale of why you're making a change.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I look at it as it's kind of a 2-step process with the future land use plan, and then how that influences zoning. And this idea of place types is kind of, the half step in between that. If we look at some of the next place types, this is where we get into some of our more residential ideas: large lot residential, small lot residential. Really, the difference here is obviously a name. Large lot residential, you'll see this in some of the open areas, greater than an acre. This is where we have, they're greater than an acre to allow for space for septic. And then our small lot residential, again, smaller lots that are connected to public sewer. And then we have a couple of mixed types of uses, the multifamily residential, where we have more of our multifamily type of housing, smaller apartment buildings, and then mixed residential, where we can see a blending of residential types and different housing choices. Neighborhood centers is one that really kind of takes in a lot. Again, kind of that mixed use feel. Thank you. And this is, again, really talking about sense of place. This is where we have kind of our small businesses, our, converting businesses. It has more of that Main Street feel. This makes it easier instead of just looking at kind of the land use plan and establishing, we don't have a singular Main Street, but the idea of these smaller neighborhood centers that are scattered throughout the township. This gives us the ability to kind of direct zoning and some of the maybe some of the items that we talked about in the last meeting with transportation to establish more of that placemaking. And suburban center, similar, a little larger as far as a space. Again, these are kind of our areas that have more of a regional draw. You think of kind of the Tillman Street area. There's good access to transit, larger buildings, office buildings, that sort of thing. And then we have our regional employment center. These are really the larger areas where you have a lot of people coming just specifically for employment. This might be more of your, I think of kind of the western end of Tillman there. And then we also have our industrial area, which kind of is its own place type in its own. And again, that's split between our light industry and our heavy industry. So I believe that's it for the place types. So we've cut them down significantly. We've kind of put them through a lens more specific to the township and blended a couple together. And then really what we're using, what we're doing here is we will take those place types and then we'll start to apply them to specific land uses so that we can get a feel for what type of developments we would see in these land uses. Any final questions on place types? Monica?
I do have one question. Where would a historical place fit in? Would that qualify as a place, or would some of these places encompass?
I think
Historical.
it's the latter, that it's I think of the rural place type. And again, this is where we can either have a very kind of simplified quick description of them or just examples, or we could dig a little deeper and actually kind of propose what would all encompass that place type. So I think of the rural place type, even in conservation subdivision. It's not just conservation of natural resources. It could be conservation of some of our historic resources. And I think it's just something, and especially in the some of the centers, I think maybe, there we go, like neighborhood center. I think just the adaptive reuse of maybe some of our historic buildings would fit nicely into that place type there.
I have a follow-up of the regional employment center versus industrial. I would like to hear your thoughts on what light industry and heavy industry is as compared to distribution centers, which is warehousing, or manufacturing, which can be light. Where do you? Could you provide an example of where that is existing today in the township?
I'll take that one. So there was definitely some overlap on that one. Regional Employment Center, to me, is Dorney Park. It's kind of singular, it's specific, it's a regional draw, both for visitors and employees. The other one, which it happens to be a heavy industry, is Nestle Purina. So those are kind of the examples. And I think there's definitely overlap on this one, and there's some overlap in the other ones, but this is one where we might And you'll see in the industrial land use, it's regional employment center and industrial. So there, I think maybe we just call it light industry because typically light industry doesn't have that employee draw. But those are some things we can think about. And any thoughts or?
I'll have to sleep on that one.
Me
You know I'll
too.
come up with something.
Yeah.
So. Thank you.
And I think it's important that we're talking industrial as a place type here, and then we'll have the industrial land use area. And you'll see as we go through the land uses that all of the land uses have multiple place types that are allowed there. Again, it's kind of being more open and prepared to what types of developments we can see and encourage kind of complementary types of developments, so that there's not really just a one-off that comes into that area that we can that we would have to do a lot more digging into zoning in the future.
Yeah, because, if I'm a large landowner and my land use is industrial, I'm going to go all in, so.
I thought of another
Words matter.
regional employment center, a hospital would be another example of regional employment center that's not industrial. So maybe we keep regional employment center, keep the industrial uses out of that.
I'm thinking of the PPL, not the training center, but the actual,
Yep.
like,
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
You
it's
know,
an employment center, but it's also light industry because it's,
Right.
So.
Right.
All right, thank you.
I do have a follow-up to those questions. For these place types specifically, will, again, the comment period, the information given to the public, if these areas are identified on the future land use map, will it also be tied to infrastructure, whether it's road network, water, sewer? I mean, is that all going to be available and
So
part of the big picture?
that's kind of how we drew our land use type lines, were primarily, and when we get into it, it's primarily utilities are a huge driver for that. So that's kind of where it's kind of embedded in the land use. And I think we have descriptions that talk about access to utilities in the land use.
And then road networks and
And
ability of our
road next to absorb
roads
the changes,
to absorb
yes.
the traffic that could potentially come with heavy industrial site or
Yep.
manufacturing.
Yep.
So looking at really our goals and strategies for land use is really just kind of one overarching goal, and that is to provide a variety of land uses that can be supported by infrastructure and resources and upholds the existing character of the township. And I think that's kind of that covers really everything that we're doing with land use. Really, the more important part is getting down into the details of where the lines are and what the specific land uses are. And then looking at our strategies.
Can we go back one
Sure.
slide? I don't want to wordsmith this to death, but can we look at the word "and" in between resources and upholds?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
I think
Bad. Okay.
this is the first time we're actually seeing both the goal and the strategies for these. So we're definitely open to wordsmithing how we can, and we'll also ask for that. I think at the end we're going to talk about kind of some feedback on this newer section and what we're looking for from everyone. So certainly, please provide your input. On strategies, the first is to utilize the land use plan to provide opportunities for growth while preserving the framework of existing neighborhoods, really covering a lot of our residential areas. The second strategy, utilize place types to develop a sense of place and ensure smooth transitions between land uses. And the third, utilize the land use plan to inform updates to the subdivision land development ordinance, zoning ordinance, and other regulatory documents to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So that's kind of where we talked about earlier, that really the hope for this land use plan is to be very implementable. We're hoping that this can help shape some of the updates to some of those more regulatory items down the line, and that whenever we're looking at any updates or changes, we're kind of coming back to this land use plan and cross-referencing that to make sure that we're fulfilling kind of the goals of what we're presenting.
I have a question on strategy number 2, utilize place types to develop a sense of place. So can you help me understand what you mean there?
Yeah, I think it's kind of just the idea of using place types, and really the hope is that this gets us one level down from land use. As you'll see in land use, just to kind of talk about residential as a whole, doesn't really give a lot of detail to what is in that residential. So utilizing the place types idea is where we're hoping to kind of establish where our neighborhoods, where our corridors, where our kind of our gateways and that sort of thing.
And I think it also has a lot to do with we talked a lot about community character and what makes that character. And that's kind of what we mean by sense of place. So, there's a certain feel to Greenwald, a certain feel to Cetronia and these different neighborhoods. And that's really where that sense of place comes in. And having a place type kind of sets the parameters for what is included in that, so that hopefully we can mimic what's working and creating that sense of place in these different neighborhoods, or enhancing sense of place.
Is it possible to edit that strategy to be more inclusive of what you said about the certain villages and neighborhoods of the township? The sense of place is a pretty broad term and open for interpretation.
Absolutely. And again, we're very open to kind of wordsmithing and workshopping these. Land use is a little different than some of the other elements, where each element prior to this, we had working groups that spent a lot of time kind of developing those more specific strategies over a longer period of time. This is where everything kind of comes together. So we're looking for feedback on, how do we get these ideas across that cover everything that we've talked about up to this point.
For number 3, sorry, I don't mean to kill this to death, but do we feel that our comp plan that we're, on the home stretch with is close to the existing Saldo and zoning, or do we feel there's going to have to be major changes to come through? I'm only making that comment because I'm kind of fresh off my MPC class, but they seem to really stress, if they don't match, it really just leaves us as the township open to risk. If a development comes in and says, well, your comp plan says this, zoning says this.
There are definitely going to be changes. I think it comes down to the degree that is agreed upon between the BOC and the Planning Commission. And again, we're just kind of setting the stage for that, and for that conversation. I don't see it as a total departure from our existing, because you can kind of still fit a lot of what's zoned into what we already have. But I think when we get to the conversation of zoning ordinances and Saldo, is we're going to really either incentivize or encourage the specific types that we're looking for. So I kind of see it as more of we have this baseline, and then we're really looking to push what we want out of that baseline. Like our current zoning is almost that baseline. So I don't see it as a big wholesale change as far as uses. I think there's some tweaks. there's some things in the zoning ordinance that, it might be, Greg's ears are going to burn.
Yeah, I might be thinking ahead too much, but I just think
Yeah.
about the timing, once
And-
this gets approved, are we like on the clock for the next like 3 months? To
No,
try
I
and
don't
beat
know.
new submissions or
No.
something?
And
I
if
guess that's really
there's,
where the question
if there is
comes.
something like that and, it's a priority, we'll certainly prioritize that and
All right.
move it along.
That was all. Thanks.
Yep.
Any other questions on the goal or strategies before we get into the plan in each land use type? Monica?
Just quickly, number 2, where it says ensure smooth transitions between land uses, that's good. Just the beginning part for me was a little abstract, but you said you will develop that a little further, right?
Yes, and if really I do encourage any suggestions to these strategies, and if there is, we feel like these 3 kind of cover everything in the goal, but if there is something that's definitely missing, certainly now is the time to bring that up if you think that there's something that you're considering as we look at the next part in the land use types. Now is the time to do it.
And one thing I just want to throw out there is for number 2, I think where appropriate is a good thing to put on the end of it, because we had our state APA conference and the concept of urban growth boundaries. So in that case, you have a hard stop of development and then open space. So in some cases it is more appropriate for, a hard stop. European villages is kind of the go-to example where you're in the village and then all of a sudden you're out in the country. So there are some places where that's appropriate. So I would just consider adding where appropriate or something along those lines.
So on the same thread, and with the number 2, is where we're going to look at like multi-municipal boundaries so that we don't have that hard stop, the hard edge. Southern end
Yes.
of one township is heavily developed. Northern edge of this township is open space, rural.
Yes, to the extent that we can control as a township, and it's just kind of looking at it holistically of how kind of the blending occurs.
And that's kind of a tricky one because, if our neighbors have zoned something that we don't want, doesn't mean we should change it to what they have. So I still think we should approach things with our focus of what we want to see. And then, one of the implementation items is investigate multi-municipal planning. And that's where, everybody gets at the table and we can kind of talk about shifting things around. But at this point, because it's a municipal comp plan, I see no problem, focusing on what we want as a township.
Any other questions? So this is the existing land use plan. This is what's on the ground right now. Just to kind of give you an overview, everything in greenish color is usually considered more open. Some of that being agriculture, some of it being just open land, or some of our more wooded areas, steep slopes, that sort of thing. Kind of moving down to the yellow, everything in yellow represents residential. Again, really everything residential. As you can see, it's a big bulk of the township. Red is our commercial areas. You can see kind of where those shopping centers are, Dorney Park down in the southern portion. And then purple is our existing industrial areas, whether that be heavy industry like Nestle Purina or some of the warehouses in the township. And then blue obviously represents water. So this is where we are going to start introducing the new land use types that we're proposing. The first one is really, we consider it more of an overlay to everything. Just it's not a specific type on its own that would look at anything separate. It's over top of all the other land uses, and we're just calling out where the natural areas are. This is important for some of our existing ordinances, future ordinances, and considerations of where development can occur. And again, it also helped to establish where those boundary lines are between proposed land uses. So some examples of the natural areas, we have woodlands, are riparian areas around stream corridors, steep slopes, as I mentioned. And as you can see, it covers a good portion of the township, a lot of that being steep slopes. And that's where we can kind of dig into whether there's regulatory items or ordinances that are proposed from this plan based on the natural areas.
Chris, do we have the ability to actually implement a steep slope ordinance so that we can have
I believe
a
so.
concrete?
I mean, other first-class townships have done it.
We do not have one currently. That's something that's,
We've had one under study for a number of years now. It's just, there's been no will to push it forward. However, coming out of this comp plan, I believe there will be some will.
thank you. And my second question on this, the middle paragraph there states protection of these areas can occur through resource protection ordinances discussed in the implementation plan. Instead of can occur, that's something we can change to prioritize to preserve or protect our steep slopes and waterways.
I think here, just showing that it's a land use, certainly when, as we look at some of the implementation and within our resource protection chapter, it is very much prioritizing all of those types of things. As far as a land use, it's, we want to be cognizant that this is the proposed land use, but its protection is voluntary in these areas. Preservation can occur through maybe some of those ordinances, but also through potential programs. But that, I think, certainly the prioritization and actual the mechanism to protect is called out as far as different implementation items and the entire chapter on resource protection.
And the other piece of this is, this is GIS based, and there's a lot of, GIS is very high level. So when you get on a site specific steep slopes, you can't really determine that until you do an actual survey. So that's kind of why it's a little looser than it potentially could be, because the data that was used to create this layer is inherently a little loose. The resolution isn't as fine.
Thank you.
Doesn't completely prevent anything, even level of slope zoning. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking in the microphone. 0 to 5%, 5 to 15%, 15 to 20, and 25 and greater. It might increase the lot sizes. What interests me is, so this is GIS based, these natural land areas. What are they basing it on? Are they basing that on a FEMA floodplain map? And then are they basing woodlands just on a
Aerial.
pocket aerial?
Yep. So in the chapter, we get into details on a little bit more of it. The woodlands were aerials, and then we actually looked at core forest, edge forest, near edge. So that was incorporated into it. And again, that'll be in kind of the background information. The steep slopes were derived from LIDAR, because soils are, they're kind of all over the place. So I used LIDAR to really fine tune it through the soils lens, because I don't know if LIDAR is light imaging detecting radar, I think. and it gets a very fine resolution. So like when I first had the map out, it actually was showing embankments of the turnpike as steep slopes. So we had to kind of filter some of that out, so that there was a process involved in the steep slopes. Is probably the best answer.
Ultimately, it's up to the developer to run the topography on his.
Exactly.
You can make a broad steep
Right.
slope zoning.
So that's exactly where the site level analysis comes in, because I mean, we can indicate that there may be, a riparian area there, but it does have to go through the process.
And for this purpose, it really is just to provide a snapshot to the entire township, just to call out natural resources in consideration of the other land use types. For example, this influences the next land use type, which is the Jordan Valley, just to kind of highlight where a lot of the existing open spaces, you can see where all those natural resources are, that it's from a 50,000 foot view, it's not a very easily developed area because of the presence of so many natural resources. So that it was really more of a guide towards that. And then any future implementation, whether it's more detailed planning efforts into like open space preservation ideas, or like the steep slope ordinance, we would dig a little deeper into like a smaller geography. So the Jordan Valley covers a large area. It's a specific land use type to South Whitehall. The idea here is it's a very special landscape that's within the Jordan Creek watershed. It's kind of different in South Whitehall compared to our neighboring municipalities, where you have to the east in Whitehall, as the watershed is a lot more developed. It doesn't have as much of your valley and your steeper areas. And then even going to North Whitehall, you get almost areas that are even greater steeped slopes and more of a canyon type of feel around some of the areas of the creek. So you have this kind of agricultural, historic, really natural covered area in the Jordan Valley. So this is something where we talk about preserving kind of the agricultural heritage and the feel. And we have large tracts of open space, undeveloped lands, and looking at preservation of natural resources, and any type of development that would occur here would be in tune with those existing resources. So if we look at I believe the next slide actually talks about the goals of the Jordan Valley. But Tim, did you have a question about the map?
I don't want to, I don't know if you guys want to drill down to specific parcels or edges of how that's laid out. But, and I recognize, looking at the other maps that are coming, there's industrial built in, et cetera, and residential. But there is one parcel there, it's like 27, 28 acres on Forefield Road. That would be like a connecting parcel between your two green sections. If there's a reason that is or is not included, is it because it's boxed in by development on both sides? To the left a little more, or to the west? Yeah.
I believe that's in our next land use type. Is that rural residential is the next one? And it was intended to be in rural residential because of the surrounding land uses around it. Again, you'll see, Dave, if you can go to the next slide, where we just kind of show the place types. There you can see we have open space, agricultural, rural, conservation, subdivision. And then you'll see some of those place types continuing into the next land use, so that in theory it could be essentially the same types of, you could see the same place types there. And the land use doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't be able to do one thing versus the other. If we're seeing kind of the encouraged place types lead whatever zoning is allowed in that area.
Chris, as a follow-up to Tim's question, is it currently zoned that way?
I would say land use is way too broad for zoning. I think, I don't know offhand the zoning of that area, of that parcel that we're talking about.
It's zoned rural residential 2, which is 80,000 square foot minimum lot size.
Yeah, thank you. So just to follow up, so what we just saw on that map to Tim's question is consistent with the current zoning. Is that right?
For that specific parcel, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I think one of the, getting to Trevor's comment, is by using place types and having the overlap, gives the flexibility when it comes time to discuss zoning. We can look at existing zoning. Do we want to change it to encourage a specific place type over another one? So really, we were looking at, and we purposely didn't look at parcels and we did not look at zoning, because I'm a big proponent of that, because we're looking at a land use plan for the whole township. The existing zoning and parcels is really when we get into zoning conversation. But the flexibility is built in there so that when it comes time for that zoning conversation about this one parcel, that conversation can come up is how can we incentivize this place type over another place type.
Okay, thank you.
I have a follow-up and maybe a suggestion. Looking at this map, it'd be really helpful if some of the roads and like the Jordan River was actually identified. I mean, we're all planners and even I'm like, is that Walworth? Yeah, that's Walworth. But if once this goes out to the public, it's going to be.
And that's so I don't know how many people were able to check out the app. But that was a online map that you could zoom in and place dots and comments. The idea is to try and run something like that for the public.
Yeah, I realize you can't do every road because it's just too cluttered. But
even
north,
so, having a
22,
dynamic map, the labels will come on and off depending on where you're at.
But you also, if you're at an event and just have a printed version of this, it's
and
it helps people find where they live.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of one of the things that we.
Some people don't even know what our township looks like.
Right.
Oh,
is that you're right. Right.
I remember. I
look at maps all day. So
2009, we had residents that actually thought they lived in the city of Allentown because they had a mailing address of Allentown, and they had no idea.
Yep.
Even though they were renters and they didn't pay they didn't have to pay their taxes.
Right.
Just something to think about.
Yep.
Thanks.
One thing I should mention, as we're kind of talking about the two land use types here, the Jordan Valley, and then we'll be moving into rural residential. I think, I don't know if it's cut off there, but just that the emphasis on that these areas do not have access to public water and public sewer. And that also kind of helps determine what can go there. So the goals of the Jordan Valley are really, there's a primary goal and then some kind of sub goals underneath that, and that's to preserve the rural and historic character of the Jordan Valley. As I mentioned, it's a very special landscape, and some of the ideas here is to preserve natural resources in those landscapes, either through incentives or cooperation with landowners that might look at actually legally protecting their properties in a variety of ways, enhancing our crossroad villages, excuse me. And as part of that attention to the surrounding landscape, we talked about, as Dave kind of mentioned, even kind of those, the drastic stops. And we're looking at, we don't want to see, a great investment into a crossroad village that's surrounded by warehouses. It's kind of looking at everything as a landscape, as a kind of continuous area. Encourage the continuation of active agriculture by allowing uses consistent with the operation of working farms, kind of protecting our farmers there, and incentivizing the utilization of conservation-based subdivisions for any future land development. Again, that it's nice to kind of have the place types idea introduce some of these concepts of conservation-based subdivision, and then here's where we actually try to put that and tie that to a certain area. So again, the place types that are encouraged within the Jordan Valley: open space, agriculture, rural, and conservation subdivision. Does anyone have questions on or comments on the goals for Jordan Valley?
I just have one comment. The last goal, to incentivize conservation-based subdivisions for any future land development. So you're saying for the entire Jordan Valley, that would be the one development type that would be indicated for that entire area?
So if it's not part of some of the other ones, so this is also, if you recall in some of the place types where we talked about the rural areas, there's the idea of kind of working farms, certainly, existing buildings there, or smaller farms, farmettes, certainly more individual development or more individual buildings. But as you're looking at kind of more large scale developments, you'll see in the next land use type, which is rural residential, where that's a lot of those have they're on existing sub streets. There's better access to water. Conservation subdivision here is probably the most appropriate strategy for those areas, and that's why there's a lot of cutouts in the Jordan Valley that's filled in with rural residential, where you have more opportunity for a denser development. Or I should say more development.
So where you're now at the Jordan Valley, from the current state of the zoning, taken away large swath of industrial, and you've taken large swaths to RR3, northwest corner of the township. So is this Jordan Valley more restrictive than those current uses? Or are the current uses still allowed in Jordan Valley, but you're saying because it's in the Jordan Valley, we're going to have restrictions?
One of the things I wanted to stress, and this is something that we stressed a lot in the 2009 comp plan, this is not a zoning map. And we have to understand that. This is a broad brush look at how we want these things to be in the future. So to ask that kind of question is not really relevant at this time. We're not in the zoning phase. So to say, is this going to be more restrictive than what's zoned now? We're not at that phase yet. This is simply something that will inform the zoning when we get there. So when we get there, we have the place types to say, well, it could be this or it could be this. We will make the decisions when we get to that point and study it more. So in a sense, you could say, yes, it's more restrictive. In a sense, you say, no, it can't be, because we haven't actually gotten to the point of establishing the zoning. So
right. Ultimately, if we intend to use this land use of the Jordan Valley and blanket green at the top, it would be more restrictive than the current zoning if it was adopted.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Because
So
we haven't gotten there yet.
Well, yeah, and when we get to the zoning conversation, part of the input is going to be what's the existing zoning. And if it's going to be more restrictive, how do we balance that between being too restrictive and not restrictive enough? So that's really in the zoning conversation. And there's mechanisms where and again, this gets to kind of what Trevor brought up is, we have to balance opening ourselves up to legal challenges.
Mhm.
And that's really when we evaluate existing zoning and this land use types and place types. And how do we creatively balance that through new zoning regulation? And there's some ideas on how to do that.
Okay. Are we good to move on to rural residential?
Yep.
So again, this kind of, you can see that this really fills in those gaps within the Jordan Valley. Again, utilities are sparse, but it's a little easier to see developments in here. Again, large lot developments, attention to kind of the rural nature of the area. There's better infrastructure here, connection to larger roads, things that can support more development, and it's kind of a nice transition between the two land use types, where you can kind of have some maybe residential development, and it's surrounded by some more open areas. So if we look at the goals for rural residential, again, it's kind of, it really is the same of preserving natural resources, important landscapes through incentives and cooperation with landowners. I think that kind of carries through, especially as we're looking at some of the natural resources still present in that area. Encourage the continuation of working farms by allowing uses consistent with operations of working farms, so that we're not kind of creating conflicts between existing farms and new developments. Incentivize the utilization of conservation-based subdivisions, and encourage the continuation of existing development in a seamless manner to preserve and enhance neighborhood character. Because you'll see that some of these start to blend into the next land use type of more of our neighborhood residential. So the place types that are encouraged here: open space, agriculture, conservation subdivision, and large lot residential.
Can you give us examples of uses that would be consistent with operations of a working farm?
This is where we might look at some of those kind of agritainment businesses or farmettes, or someone who might want to have maybe a larger lot, country feel, maybe want to have horses there. It's more appropriate to have in this area, still residential neighborhood, but not in in the middle of some of our existing neighborhoods. So this is more of an area where it's you're still having residential, but it's in an area that it's not developed as intensely to impact farming, and it's also more consistent with some of the impacts of farming.
Thank you.
Just to follow up, I think it's if you look at the ag place type, there's multiple types of agriculture in there. The example of a pig farm would be not appropriate because in this land use type, it's adjacent to existing residential. So that's another layer of flexibility that's built into it. There's different components to each place type. So when it comes to zoning, when we look at ag for this land use, working farm might not be as appropriate as a farmette or some, that's really where that goal came from.
Thank you.
Diving into the next land use type is our neighborhood residential. Again, this covers pretty much existing neighborhood residential. There's not really a lot of opportunity here for any real big changes. Again, the importance here is These areas are served by utilities. These are much smaller lot sizes allowed here. And it's looking at really providing a variety of housing types. And really most of the township's population lives within this kind of neighborhood residential area. It's where the people are. So looking at the goals for neighborhood residential, this is where we really want to kind of address our housing needs, providing that variety of housing types, and encouraging housing of that can actually satisfy different income levels. This is where we would evaluate pedestrian safety, connectivity, both within the neighborhoods and to kind of the other land use types. Again, kind of talking about those transitions, encouraging walkability.
I just want to jump in. I'm responsible for putting pet shed analysis in there.
Yes. I was thinking, am I going to have to explain pet shed?
So I'm going to change that. Basically, it's you looking at pedestrian sheds, so like a watershed. Where are the barriers to walkability? Think of 22. So you can't cross 22, but you could live within a quarter mile of a house. So when you do those pedestrian connectivity analyses, you have to put in the barriers. So that's really where that comes from.
And usually they're associated with a certain amount of walk time. So a 5-minute walk shed, where can you get within 5 minutes of a central area? 10-minute walk shed, where can you get within 10 minutes? And then understanding how those barriers fit in as well.
So maybe we could just
We will
wordsmith that for. We'll still certainly, look at the analysis, but as far as a goal, we can put something in there more residents will understand. And the final one, consider traffic calming, congestion where possible and where appropriate. I think we can add where appropriate on there. The place types here, small lot residential, mixed residential. I forget. Is that
multifamily?
Multifamily. Thank you. Any questions on neighborhood residential? This is a pretty easy one.
Excuse me, Chris, I do have a quick question. For traffic calming, would this mean in neighborhood residential, the not allowing trucks?
It would be, so I think in our transportation meeting last month, we talked about kind of the different ways that we can look at traffic calming, whether it be physical infrastructure, whether it be identification of where truck routes are, and looking at where we can post where no trucks are allowed. To answer your question, yes, that's kind of, this is not within these areas. This is not where we're looking to encourage a lot of pass-through traffic.
Sure. Do you know if our township has that right now? Do we have a map where there are certain roads where trucks are prohibited?
I'd have to defer.
That involves a traffic study, doesn't it?
Yeah, we have. What's it? I don't think we have a map, but I mean, the only one that comes to mind is Ridgeview, right here. But yeah, it's something that we talked about in the traffic. I think it's the transportation plan to identify truck routes.
Thank you.
So the next land use type that's a layer kind of in between is what we're calling our neighborhood corridors. And this was one that through some of our public engagement was certainly a more popular discussion point with residents. They really liked this idea. So this is where we're calling out kind of our more specific corridors, our roadways that operate as kind of the gateways to the community. This is where we're focusing a lot of activity between neighborhoods and commerce and sort of our ability to have some mixed uses along these areas. Again, they're within neighborhoods, they're served by utilities, and this is where we'd see multiple forms of transportation. This is kind of where we look at opportunities to have better transit. We talked about walkability, different modes of transportation, whether that be bicycling or something like that. And it's more of the kind of complete streets idea. Are there any questions on neighborhood corridor? And we can go through the goals here. Sorry about that.
Is Tillman highlighted on there?
No, Tillman is not. We can go through, so that the northern ones are Walbert. And the reason it's bisected is because the intersection is in the next land use type, which is our commercial area. And so the neighborhood corridor, it's not necessarily an overlay, but you can almost consider it an overlay. So it's it's surrounded by the neighborhood residential and the next land use type, which is commercial.
The other thing with the corridors, and you'll notice that this was used, a line was used as opposed to an area. Getting to the point of not looking at parcel lines, that's really a zoning conversation. We identified the corridor, and then once we get to the zoning conversation, then we identify parcels and how far back we go. It's probably going to be, one parcel out from the corridor. But that's one of the things with this that you'll notice is different than the other ones. And Tillman, and Chris kind of brought it up, is they stop at business districts. So where they stop, like you'll see the Walbert doesn't continue, that's a business district. What's that?
Yeah, you can see right there. It's
Yeah, that little, I was thinking like east of 309 and like Parkway. Could be that, but I mean, that also makes sense.
If you can go back one, I can go through the goals of the neighborhood corridors, and it really is kind of encouraging those mixed uses, small business development. It's part of our transitions, again, from the one land use type to the next. We talked about walkability, and then that's where some of our kind of beautification ideas come in. And that's really what kind of separates the neighborhood corridor from necessarily some of the other roads within our neighborhood residential, that these are specific to kind of the roadways and the corridors there, where we can do some things like streetscaping and so forth. And the place types there are mixed residential and neighborhood commercial. So looking at the next one we kind of talked about already is our business district. And we look at this as kind of the center of all of our economic activity. These have more sort of regional draws. These are more connected to larger road networks. And it's kind of a combination of businesses, shopping, employment, entertainment, and that sort of hub of activity. So the goals for this.
Can I just ask you one question?
Sure.
The western parcel for Ridge Farms, so west of Cedar Crest.
Yes.
On all of these maps are inconsistent with what the topic is. So I would think that the western parcel would be included in red here, and it's not.
The red parcel of Ridge Farms is the traditional neighborhood development. So that is a kind of a mixed use. So that's where we have a lot of commercial activity there. So I'm sorry if I said the western, the eastern I meant is that's why it's included here. To the west is purely residential.
I thought there were 4 apartments with retail space on the bottom floor.
Yes, and that's part
On
of the commercial business district.
On the west side.
On the
On the
west
west
side.
side?
No.
Oh, that's all strictly residential. They're condominiums, towns over
Apartments.
flats.
Condos, yeah.
There was
There's
nothing,
no
there was
commercial
no
on
retail
the-
on the first
on
floor?
There was no
Northwest
commercial on that side, no.
Albert Avenue.
Okay.
It's limited to actually where you see that.
Yeah,
The only commercial.
okay.
And again, these weren't looked at a specific parcel level, but we definitely included the first phase of Ridge Farms there because it's such a large area.
Okay, thanks.
The goals here are, as you can see, in a lot of this, there's not a lot of space for new development, but really we're encouraging some infill and redevelopment and incorporating kind of that mixed use where we want to see make it easier to have the ability to have kind of residential mixed with some of our commercial connectivity to the surrounding land uses so that even though these are regional draws, you shouldn't have to feel like you have to get in a car and drive, 20 minutes just to get a quarter mile away to a shopping center, and encouraging regional connectivity, not just through single-use cars, but through transit and multimodal infrastructure. And the place types here are, I forget, is that?
Suburban center and regional center.
Thank you. I miss our hexagons.
I know.
Are there any questions on the
Regional
business
Employment
district?
Center.
Yes. Yeah, and I think you saw there was Dorney Park to the south there. Okay, so the final one is pretty self-explanatory. This is our industrial. It does represent regional employment centers, as we mentioned. There are a lot of employees that come to the particular industrial areas we already have in the township. We also look at this. Oh, that's the wrong description in there. But so our industrial areas, we look at the different levels of industry. We talked earlier about kind of heavy industry and light industry, understanding that heavy industry might have more impacts to the surrounding area, whether that be just the noise, what's produced there, and even traffic. But all of that is included in this land use type. If we go to the goals, we talked earlier about kind of transitions, but also Dave mentioned the need to kind of separate land uses. This is where we would not just encourage, but require buffers, depending on the proportion of their degree of impact. Certainly, Nestle Purina is a good example of the need for buffers, and you don't want to see houses develop directly around that for obvious reasons. Considering transit and multimodal connections, this is really important as we see some of our new developing industrial areas. I see Brian hopefully nodding his head there as we certainly we have opportunities for employees to get to some of our warehouses by car, but to make sure that we have other ways that they can get there.
Yeah, I would, the second bullet to support industrial employees would be a better.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah, I
trying
like
to support
that. Yeah.
the employees getting to these places.
Yes.
I could care less about the employer. I'm worried about the employees, so.
No, that's a good comment. Thank you. And to really the last one, I think this was kind of brought up earlier, coordinating development along the routes that can really handle the type of development, whether it be the amount of transportation, the type of transportation we just talked about, truck routes, and that's where kind of all the pieces blend in together. So I think maybe I don't know if it was Mark's comment or Tim's comment earlier, but the place types, we would see different place types in here and allow for different types of opportunities. You'll notice we included conservation subdivision in here. As we talked earlier about this place type, it's not just residential. There's terrific examples of conservation-based design with industrial uses. I've seen some examples in the US and yeah. Oh yeah. It's a great example. And actually we should include that in the plan. So all of this comes together. I guess before we look at the final map, are there questions or comments on industrial?
I have one question on both on the business and the industrial. Are there currently any residential areas, residential dwellings in these areas that you've designated for these two?
I'm going to say
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it's a lot of them are encouraging mixed uses.
So with with the business, I'm all over the place here, sorry. One of the things with the business district that we heard throughout the process is encouraging redevelopment because all the infrastructure is there, access to the roads. So that's really where the business district came in. So there is some residential in these areas. Again, with the industrial, there's some residential in there, but it's predominantly non-residential.
I don't know. Do we have the map of everything together? Well, I mean, so everyone should have the link to the interactive map. And oh, wonderful. There we go.
So here's the interactive map that has all the layers on it. The symbology is a little tricky with the online version, so it doesn't exactly match, but it's pretty close. So this is the whole thing put together, and you can zoom into specific areas to get a better feel for it. And you can kind of see how the labels pop on and off as you zoom in more.
And this is what we would put out during the public comment period to allow people to be more engaged with the land use conversation, because we've had kind of the draft goals and strategies for all the other elements open for months now. And we've gotten feedback from that. And I think this is probably the more important area to get public input.
So what's the character limit? Because I was playing with this map and
it's kind of small.
Yeah.
It's like 50. So I think if we do send this out, I think we can put, and I've used it before, is where you put a email link. So you just click the link and we can add a subject on it already automatically. So we know it's a comment from the map on a specific land use. So then they would just fill out an email as opposed to.
Because, a resident will
Right.
tend to ramble like I do sometimes,
Yeah.
but to get their point across, and a lot of times you find a lot of valuable content in a paragraph rather than 50 characters.
Yeah, it's definitely less than a tweet.
Right.
and this will go kind of hand in hand with the general public comment. We kind of look at this as just an even greater opportunity for people to get specific. So typically we would just have them weigh in on the land use chapter and send comments. But this way, when I think I forget, was it Mr. Spiegel who sent the very detailed letter, who gave us very specific information, geographic information. This way, if someone wants to talk about something in their comments, they have the ability to actually put a point on so that we can see where they're talking. If if we can't interpret what they mean.
And this is where it's important to have labels so people,
Mm-hmm.
is there a way that somebody could put their address in
I just did it.
and then boom? Yeah, I'm an industrial.
What's your address?
I'm a residential use in an
In
industrial use.
That would be grandfathered.
We're not allowed to use grandfather anymore.
Oh.
It's a racist term, just so you know.
Pre-existing non-conforming.
So was that non-conforming, right?
Pre-existing
But,
non-conforming.
you know, in the
yes,
70s,
sorry.
my property was rural residential, and then it came, long story. So,
Yeah,
that-
so there's an
and-
address find. I just
and
did
is there
the-
going to be like a simple user guide that somebody, 8th grade level?
So the adding the point is definitely adds a lot more complexity to it,
Mhm.
and I can't add. I'm limited to 50 characters
Right.
for the point, but I can add an email when you click the land use, or I might break them up into sub areas. I don't know how best to do it, but I think the best way to get the comments. So if you click in industrial, I can have a link in there that says email comment, and you click that link and it'll pop open your email.
Right.
I think is probably the easiest way to do it. Adding the point is it's a little more to it. But we can kind of play around with it. And that's kind of, I wanted to see how you guys did with it. Brian, you did great.
Yeah. I think to Brian's point is if there's a way for us to create a little bit of a tutorial, because when you when you load this in its full extent, it's very busy.
Mm-hmm.
And for anybody that's not computer savvy or mapping savvy or has the ability to try to pick and pull things apart, you know, I think of my parents. If they looked at this, they'd be like, I don't know what to do with that.
We could look into a video walkthrough
That's what I was going to suggest, because
and then have that on our YouTube
solved
channel.
a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And I think having that on, starting with the address, you know, you type in your address is probably the best way to go. So then you're automatically oriented, and then you can go from there. Or if you want to look up a different address, it's easy. It's an easy way to do it.
Is it possible to get the future land use map over our current land use map so that we can see the changes, or is there a list of the changes, the more significant ones?
It's the 2009 map. I was afraid somebody was going to ask that. The 2009 map is, I can do a quick overlay.
Well, what if you put the zoning portal on a different browser?
So to do the zoning, I can do the zoning, I can overlay the zoning, but I kind of am shying away from that because we're in the comp plan. But comparing it to the 2009 comp plan, I can, well, I'm thinking about how to do it, and I have an idea of how to do it. That'll be pretty easy. And there's a swipe function.
Yeah, that's how Upper Mackenzie does it.
Okay.
Upper Mackenzie has a story map and they do for their comp plan. And you just drag it across.
I think that would be helpful to understand the proposed future changes compared to where we are.
And I guess, are we talking about the 2009 land use plan, or, so earlier in the presentation, we showed the current land use, but that's of today. And I believe
I think we can we could probably show all of them. Is that?
I said that's
Oh, yeah. When they're all overlaid, it'll be pretty crazy. But existing land use in the 2009 comp plan, and then the future land use I think is probably what we need. And it ties into how we laid out the draft, because a lot of what we talk about is the 2009 plan, things that have changed. So having the story map that talks about land use, comparing 2009 to existing, continues that narrative.
Thank you.
So to kind of wrap up land use, I want to, do we want to talk about kind of our goal here for land use before we get into implementation? I think,
I have a,
yes, Brian.
not to cut you off, but to go back to this, is this only going to be online for comments?
No, we just haven't talked about how we'll have it set up yet here in the township for.
Right.
We'll have the draft plan, and I think we'll have a map available. But if someone's coming into the township, we can certainly run through this map with them.
Yeah, because there's portions of our residents that don't have internet or don't want to be on the internet. They want to be off the grid, but this concerns them. It concerns everybody here. So I think the more avenues for inclusion, the better.
Yeah, we'll absolutely have the draft plan available, and we just haven't talked about how many copies and
including a Spanish version would be nice.
That would be nice. I know that getting the translation services for an entire comp plan. I don't know, Hannah. I know I've in your experience with the city, I think the city, their comp plan had the entire thing translated. I don't know if that was done with an outside partner or.
That, I mean, the translation of the entire comp plan usually contract with a translating service. So you're just because there's so many different dialects and all of that. But I think for online purposes, I think Esri does offer some Google Translate opportunities.
So everyone, yeah, go ahead.
We're almost at 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And let's talk timeline. So we can jump ahead to that. I think what we want to get tonight out of land use is the okay to incorporate it into the draft with changes we discussed. So that's really what we're looking to get, kind of as we've done with all the other goals and strategies. We come back with that synthesized version, and then we incorporate it into we were doing online, but this one will go right into the draft. So that's the first piece of information we're looking to get feedback on, whether you're comfortable with that going in. The second piece that we're not going to have time to cover tonight unless we decide to stay longer, is the implementation. And I can't believe I said that, but the implementation piece. But I think that we might be able to send out digitally, and you can comment on that digitally, because it's not, land use is a tough one because we're talking maps and, we have to zoom in and zoom out, and there's a lot of discussion, rightfully so, because it's the most important piece of it. But I think we can handle the implementation piece just emailing it out. So I think that gets us, we can take care of that implementation. We'll send out package and email together in the documents. We've filled it out as much as we can. At the first blush, we'll probably go in and fill in more information. But one of the things that we want to get out of that for the implementation is the timeline and the priority. So we might do and Hannah will figure out how we can do this, is a prioritization and duration or timeline. So we took a stab at it and, kind of just used the same for almost all of them. But again, this is the Planning Commission's recommendation to the BOC. The intent of the implementation is really it's a BOC document, and the BOC uses this to prioritize and direct, if Planning Commission's involved, or direct staff to use this implementation. So as the Planning Commission makes a recommendation for their priorities, BOC has the option to prioritize something higher or delay. So that's kind of the balancing act on this side of it. So we'll figure out how to get that to you so that you can do those priorities and durations. Just a rough layout on it. We'll have a summary sheet, which is kind of laid out like this, each of the focus areas that it hits, the timeline and priority. So hopefully we can get this on one page. We combined a lot of the implementation into, I forget how many, but it should fit on a page.
I think we have 25.
Okay.
And we're looking at kind of I was talking to the designer yesterday about, we might have it as an open, like across 2 pages, kind of a nice larger spread.
So here's an example of the detail. There it is. Example of the details on a specific implementation item. It's modeled after the workbook. So the workbook recommendations had the same, like, how's it moving around? So this is information that we'll send out to everybody. Brings us to timeline. So this is where we want to hear comments, particularly from BOC, because ultimately they'll be adopting it. So the MPC requires a 45-day comment period. And I believe it's just a recommendation. Doesn't need to be a motion from the Planning Commission. Just a recommendation from the Planning Commission to open the public comment period. That starts the 45 days. And that's really what's dictating adoption. But after that 45 days is closed, we have the opportunity to make changes to the plan that aren't substantive. So one of the comments we did receive related to the plan adoption date. So this was, if we had full buy-in and everybody tonight said, launch the draft for public comment, we could probably have that draft compiled with the land use in by the end of the week. So I'm not expecting, because you guys haven't even seen it yet. So that would be an unrealistic ask. But if you guys want to. So what the plan for us right now is to incorporate land use. We may or may not, I don't know, Chris, were we going to incorporate land use and then send it, or send it and then incorporate land use?
I was thinking we could send it for everyone to look at, because land use is essentially going to be what we ran through tonight. The only change is a little bit of filler here and there. But unless, and that also gives people time to weigh in. I think some of the wordsmithing of our goals and strategies, I would like to give the same amount of kind of review time for, and then we can kind of add that in.
So I guess the first question is the board comfortable with the land use based on what the conversations tonight?
Noting that we'll adjust the goals and strategies as far as just the wordsmithing of it.
I personally would be more comfortable if I could see a juxtaposition of the new over the old, or even a side by side. It would just make it much easier to visualize what the changes are. Because it's one thing looking at it and saying, this is what we're going to do going forward. But when you see it compared to the
The,
old map,
Or
it's,
even current.
the
Yeah.
one comment I have is the one thing that you're going to notice right away is it's a lot simpler. The 2009 land use plan was complex. There were a lot of overlays, a lot of different hatching. So that's the one thing you're going to notice immediately is this is a lot simpler and cleaner. So I'm worried that when we do the comparison, that map is,
It's
I
also
dare say,
apples and oranges too.
Yes.
Because the 2009 it described it via the transect. And this is really not like that at all. So you're looking at two very different maps and trying to compare them. I think you might be better seeing the current land use map versus the future land use map, because that is apples to apples. So
okay.
I just think it's fair to, prior to public comment, everybody here should be comfortable with what's going to be represented. Because there's always going to be, the outlier who's going to come and scream about this, which will take us and derail us from our goals, right?
Right.
Oh, you're already.
I'm saying no more screaming.
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Flagg. I would hate to have most of the public comment come from this board.
okay.
It should be back.
Are we back?
Tom, are we back? Audio?
Yes, now you are.
Thank you.
yeah.
Okay, Commissioner.
Yep, thank you, Brian. My comments, and I apologize for this being after the scheduled time, but I've waited on purpose after hearing the discussion. So I mean to be helpful. Also, I mean to be direct. And, but also, I just want to make sure that my comments are perceived as I would like to make them, being helpful. First of all, I'd like to say it's obvious to me that we have 4 professionals on the other side of this dais, and you're coordinated. So I really, really appreciate that. Also, it's obvious to me that the Planning Commission members are on top of their game. They have background and they have valuable input. But I do have a couple comments that I'd like to make. And first, Greg, I will address you. And I mean, again, I just mean this to be helpful. So you and I, and perhaps another member in the room, were involved in the 2009 comprehensive plan. And I don't know if anyone in the audience was as well or not. But my first question, I'd like to lead off with a question. How much do you think the 2009 comprehensive plan actually had on what we see in our township today?
Wow. Are you,
I will-
looking
I will
for a
take this to-
percentage factor
Pardon me?
here, or?
Pardon me?
Are you looking for a percentage factor? I mean,
Just a qualitative answer. I'm going somewhere with this.
yeah, I mean, on the development that has occurred since the adoption of the plan, wow. I mean, obviously it has had an impact. I can point to two large developments that came directly out of the 2009 comp plan. If you'd like them named, I can name them, but I think you probably know which ones they are. But other than that, for the most part, the township has basically not had a lot of development. I mean, its neighborhoods are still its neighborhoods. We've not added significantly to those. There are some ongoing projects that predate the 2009 plan, especially in the western side of the township. So there has been an impact, but I don't think it's huge. Certainly, we've seen growth in the last 14 years, but not to the degree that we'd seen in the 80s or 90s.
And some of that change in the landscape in the township actually wasn't a direct result of the comprehensive plan, but zoning following that and overlays applied.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So I mean to ask that question to establish the importance of this comprehensive plan as we go forward, in comparison to what I personally believe was perhaps little impact directly from the 2009 plan. As modified, yes. But I also notice at least a difference in strategy that I'd just like to talk about a little bit. It was mentioned that the 2009 plan in writing was more pictorial, was more descriptive than pictorial. And the drive now in this upcoming plan is to be more pictorial and less descriptive. So I just want to make a little comment here. As I looked at the 2009 plan and as I look at other planning products, the pictures that I see in the publications to me are not necessarily reflective of what we see when development actually happens. They are, again, this is just my personal opinion, but they are artist renditions of what these words say this will look like. But when you drive around the Lehigh Valley and see how many of those pictures are, can I find them? My personal opinion is no, you can't. So just thought, as we go to more pictures and less prose, I would like to see the pictures actually be more representative of what we might actually see as this plan's implemented and not an artist's rendition, because that's not what we see when we drive around. Just a thought. I like prose because I can look at the words and I can try to understand what these words were trying to convey. Pictures to me, when they're not reality as things happen, I think can be a little deceptive. Just a comment. I think of the pictures as being glorified, artist renditions, and certainly, idealistic. But so I'll stop there. Some of the language actually in the slides and in past meetings, I think as flowery. I don't see the exactness in the words, but I see more of a pattern of what one word was used this evening, which I agree with, was abstract. So I do understand how you have to start with something like that. But in the end, here's what I'd like to say. I think of the comprehensive plan because this is the way the MPC calls it out. It's a planning commission product. That's what it is. And we have experts and people with experience on the planning commission. So I think of the comprehensive plan and what will be delivered to the BOC as a vision for the BOC to use as a guide for land use ordinances. But here's my concern. absent of feedback from local businesses or landowners into this process before the plan is delivered to the BOC, I think skips an important step. I understand it's difficult to get. It may not be possible to get, but that is what South Whitehall will look like 10 years from now as we go through this comprehensive plan. We can use all the language we want. We can put all the pictures into this document that we want, but it will look like what the businesses and the landowners want it to look like. We can do our planning. We can say this is the way it's going to look, but they have rights. And we need to understand what their rights are and our rights are. And that only happens when we have a conversation with them. So my point is, absent of a conversation, this may be an academic exercise. We need to have that, in my personal opinion. So as the Planning Commission delivers this to the BOC, I would like to encourage you, please stay involved in this process, because you have experience, an ongoing experience that I personally think the Board of Commissioners and the community can use on an ongoing basis, because what we will get won't be implementable. We will have to force it in several cases. That forcing can be very, very difficult. And yet this is our opportunity today to do a little bit better, in my opinion, than the 2009 plan predicted the version of South Whitehall that we would see today. So that's what I'd like to say. I would like all of us to stay engaged in the process, because it won't be done until we have communication with the landowners and businesses. So thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Are we still on? Yeah, we have public comments. I guess, do we want to open it up to is there anyone online that wants to make a comment? I think it's all township staff. I know there was someone on earlier.
Tom did have a question about land use.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Real quick, I know it's late. My question was related to where a residential use becomes a non-conforming use. I know we mentioned, some of the residential uses will be in industrial, commercial zones. Will those people have to go through a process every time they're improving their properties in terms of accessory uses, or, if they're putting on an addition and so forth? Will they have to go to the zoning hearing board each time, or will there be a simplified or streamlined process to help them through that, through making those improvements?
Tom, I believe right now, currently we have a streamlined process. Generally, legally conforming or pre-existing nonconformities can expand up to 25% just with zoning officer approval. So there is that capability, and I think we probably do want to maintain that to allow any pre-existing legal nonconformities to improve over time. So
Okay.
that is not only a residential, I believe that is across the board. So commercial in a residential district, an industrial in a commercial district, they all have those rights as well.
Okay, so the plan will make a recommendation to keep that in place.
It could.
Okay.
I think that's really important to keep in the plan as a resident in a pre-existing non-conforming property.
And I think a lot of it gets built into zoning.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it can't be included in comp plan. And I think actually probably putting that statement into our implementation for updating zoning.
What I think is important is whatever zoning they have now, if they're made non-conforming, that whatever zoning, like for example, setbacks continue on rather than trying to integrate with industrial use.
Yeah, and yes, and that's zoning.
Right.
Right.
But it's something to always be cognizant of.
Yeah, and that does always make, fairly large changes in the zoning ordinance challenging. So it's something that we look at every time we do make those changes. We're cognizant of the people who are changing any part of their zoning regulations. So that is something we always look at.
So I think we will incorporate we'll get the comparison maps. We'll try and get a few of them together. Make the changes to the goals and strategies we talked about tonight. Get those to you as soon as possible. We will also get you the implementation items and ask for prioritization. We will get you the draft that we have now. It's up on the screen. Oh, it jumped up to 123 pages. Just to give you a feel for how it's being laid out. Starts with background, 2009 plan, history, and it's been laid out again so that we can use sections of it as we need it for grants. If somebody asks what's the demographic characteristics of the township, we can just pull out the 2 pages of the comp plan. So it's very graphical. There's hopefully plenty of text. And a lot of the text that we've added has been more descriptive and or provide background. So all of the goals and strategies that we've spent all of these workshops are all in there. I'm trying to get to one of those pages. So here's an example of the goals and strategies pages. So this is the exact language that we talked about. So every page or every section will have a page with the goals and strategies. So again, when we start working with this document and we're talking about zoning updates, what was the community utilities goals and strategies? We can just pull that page out and we have everything right at our fingertips. So the idea of making the plan very usable and user-friendly as we go through the process of doing all of the implementation has been the priority for us. So we will send this out. I think we have like our older land use stuff in here. We will take that out and just send it without that part in. So I wanted to show you where we were at, just so that you had an idea. So we'll get those three things to you. And I think we can start shifting, and we can talk about it a little bit more, but at the planning commission meetings, having a more robust comp plan discussion, because as Brad kind of mentioned, it's a planning commission document. So we can start doing a little bit more work at the planning commission level. And then packaging it up to open it up to comment. So getting back to the timeline, one of the comments revolved around the adoption date. Yep. So one of the questions is having the BOC adopt the plan 4 days before Christmas. And synchronizing that adoption date. And this is really for BOC to think about when they want to adopt. And, holidays are always a tough time. So that's kind of the balancing act that we have to look at as far as when our public comment period's open and when that adoption date is. So that's, I think, for BOC to really kind of think about, and we can tailor when we open it up to public comment period based on that.
I know historically, not speaking for the Board of Commissioners, the last couple of meetings of the year involve budgets and all kinds of, so I'm not going to speak for them. They were elected for a reason, but it might make sense to push it till January, but that's just my opinion.
And just so you're aware, this graphic shows you basically tonight opening the public comment period, and you see it closes on 11/26. We do have a planning commission meeting on the 20th. Should you decide to open it after that, we're looking at 12/4 as the close. Once we move to the next meeting, 11/8, that pushes the public comment close to 12/23, which would be after our targeted adoption date. So keep those dates in mind.
My concern is too, if, let's just say we stick with this just for sake of discussion, if there's substantive changes, that restarts the 45-day clock, correct?
It restarts making the changes and
Right.
then starting the 45.
Yeah, you got to make the
clock,
changes,
right?
then we got to recommend to start the public comment again. So I know, I mean, I'm newer, right? So, haven't been going through it as long as everyone else. But I don't think we want to rush trying to hit the 12/21 deadline, just my personal opinion, because I really don't want to have to go through it all again. And I'm sure you don't either. So, it may make more sense to just take a deep dive through the draft leading up to the 11/8 workshop. And then at that meeting, planning commission meeting, making a recommendation for.
And potentially
To send it to the BOC.
we may have the modeling results by then too as well.
Yeah, I just feel it, to me, it feels, I mean, it's exciting to get done, but I feel like we're a touch early, for better or for worse.
I think the modeling is going to be important to see.
And my inner
Where it's gonna
engineer
lead
wants a
us.
model.
I'm just curious if there's a plan already in place for how we're going to do outreach to get public comment during this 45-day period. Has that already been strategized by?
It hasn't, other than mimicking what we've done before. So having, the website, and I think some of having open houses at schools has been successful. And then I think because we'll have physical copies, having physical copies at the library with directions on how to comment or walk on over and see one of us. So those are things that we've already done, and had a measure of success with that. So I think we would just kind of mimic what we've already done. I think probably the most successful outreach we've had was the postcard that we sent out for the How Should We Grow survey. And the response rate on that was pretty good. But that was during COVID. So a lot of people were home. So we may have gotten that response because people were home and looking for something to do. So that's kind of the balancing act that we'll work on. But we don't have anything set in stone on like a specific public engagement strategy, but other than repeating what we did.
if I can make a suggestion, we might want to reach out to local media, including the Morning Call and WFMZ, and just have some kind of statement that we are in this phase, public comment period will be
Yep.
here, documents
Perfect. Great
available.
idea. Yep, absolutely.
And this way
We
it's a
have
broader,
like and I forget the radio station.
LVR.
LVR.
LVR did the story, so I'm sure they would be looking to do a follow-up, but absolutely reaching out to the other papers.
And we're familiar with the reporter from East Penn Press, Sue Rumble. I think we can probably figure out who's covering the township for the morning call. That'll change it so regularly.
All right, we done? Any other questions, comments? I'm going to make the motion to adjourn.
Second,
All those in favor?
aye.
Hi.
Thank you to the
Opposed?
staff.
Thank you.